Hey Al, it feels kind of weird sitting here without a guitar. Uh, Over the weekend, somebody asked me to recommend a rock and roll book. So that got me thinking, which one would I recommend? And of course, the next step from there is I realized that the world needs to know my recommendations on rock and roll books. So I'm going to go through some of the ones that I like for different reasons, not necessarily in any order. Now, of course, the caveat is it's a little bit hard because I'm trying to spread them out among different bands, because otherwise I'd have a bunch of Zeppelin books that I really like, or a bunch of Beatles books. There's some cool Stones books. So try to give a little smattering of different things in no particular order. So if you're looking for rock and roll books and you like sort of classic rock, here are some ideas. These aren't in any order, but I've kind of stacked them up over here with the big ones down on the bottom. So I'm going to try to put the big ones, do the big books first, so I can stack them over here so they all stand up. Okay, this one is Evenings with Led Zeppelin. I think it came out just a couple of years ago. And really, I will say anything by Dave Lewis is sort of essential for Zeppelin fans. He actually was, and still is, I think, pretty close to the band members, and what was about the only journalist, if you call him that. He ran a fanzine called Tight But Loose, which I think still exists. Yeah, I think it is. It's online now. And went on the 1980 tour of Europe with them, and got one-on-one interviews with them when the band wasn't really giving interviews at that time. So very knowledgeable, of course, and he does write from a fan's perspective, but not really gushing. This particular book is more of a review of live shows. In fact, it goes all the way up. Does it go to present day and post? Yeah, it does. Well, no, it ends in with the 1980 tour, and it got all kinds of information about the different venues where they played, press coverage, what songs they did. Talks about bootleg recordings of the different shows. Super thick, really cool pictures. Probably on the expensive side, but you can probably get a used one of it. It might be out in paperback for all I know. But if you're obsessive about live Led Zeppelin, this is a pretty good start for studying. Although the purist in me looks at the cover picture from the Boston Tea Party in '69 and sees that they stuck Jonesy over here, even though he's actually not in this picture. They took him from the different pictures. That kind of leaps off at me, off the page at me, but I digress. Next band, Free, a book called Heavy Load. I don't know, this one is a little bit harder to find, but you do see it occasionally on eBay and Amazon. David Clayton, Todd Smith. In fact, this is one of the better rock and roll books I've read on any band. Goes through the whole sort of drama of the band. It ends up being as much a story about Kossoff as it is about the band. But the definitive account of Free, no question. It's called Heavy Load. Another one to track down if you're a classic rock fan. Of course, this is the Beatles' Bible in terms of the recording sessions. It's called The Complete Beatles Recording Sessions. Mark Lewis and everybody, you're probably already familiar with this book. Harder to find in hardcover. But it literally goes through every session they did, all the way through the history of the band. Tons of cool pictures, little details about who played what they recorded at different sessions. Even some, pictures of them in the studio recording stuff. Got the session charts and all that kind of thing. Just definitive and a really cool companion for listening to session outtake bootlegs and stuff like that. But it's one of those books where you're like, man, can't somebody do this version of Zeppelin? Do a book like this that goes through every Zeppelin. Of course, you'd kind of need Jimmy's cooperation to do that kind of book. Whereas the way EMI did the Beatles recordings, the most of the takes and different tracks still exist. They were all digitized. In fact, I think that's when he started going through this. EMI asked him to do an inventory of all the tapes, so he went through listening to them and he cataloged everything and it turned into a book. But I don't know if Lewison was the one who actually did the work, but he's the one who ended up authoring the book. In fact, I think the fellow who did all the actual research died shortly after the publication. But that is essential. If you're a Beatle fan, you must find a copy of this. They're really cheap, used. You probably get them for less than $10. Absolutely essential for rock fans. Kind of a companion to that is the Beatles Gear book. And again, if you're a fanatic, it's Andy Babiak, and I'm not just praising him as a writer because I know him, but just it goes through the different years and different songs, different albums, what guitars, what instruments they were playing at different periods. Pretty authoritative. Some of them are not the actual picture of the actual guitar or bass or whatever, but one just like it. But a lot of them are actual pictures of different guitars they used on different sessions. Kind of a cool reference if you're wondering, wow, what tone is that? What were they using there? Gives you a pretty good idea of that kind of stuff. So another one that if somebody tried to do a Zeppelin version of this book last year or the year before, but that one's it's a piece of junk. I wouldn't recommend that. But the Beatles Gear book, Andy Babiak, good book. Going in a different direction, Big Star, and the name of the book is The Story of Rock's Forgotten Band. Big Star, The Story of Rock's Forgotten Band. I don't know how familiar the average rock and roll pop music fan is with Big Star, but theirs is another one of those sort of almost like a Badfinger kind of story of hard luck. And they're the two albums, I think they only did two. That there's a third album that is a quasi Big Star album, I guess. But the first number one record is their first album, which to call your band Big Star is kind of funny. And to have your first album called number one record, I just think that tells you the sort of sensibility of the band. They were very clever, in my opinion. But absolutely fascinating story. And if you're not familiar with their music, this is a good kind of primer and intro to it. Big Star is one of those bands that where, spending very little time and very little money if you wanted to download the music, you could have their entire output for $30 or something, because they weren't very long-lived band, but a really cool story, fascinating story about the business and what happens to a band over time. Okay, Hendrix. That's another one where there are tons and tons of Hendrix books. Most of them are not very good. This is the definitive Hendrix book. It's called Electric Gypsy. Who wrote this? Harry Shapiro and Caesar Glebic, but this is just definitive. It goes through his actual story, and then the appendices are a full discography, which for Hendrix is pretty complicated, and just a lot of credits and stuff and interviews. And this is the Hendrix book to get. If you were going to have one, it needs to be this one. Not really a gushing kind of fan kind of book, but gives Jimmy I think the respect that he is due as an artist and not as a pop star or a rock star. Okay, Sky Dog, the Duane Allman story. Again, the Allmans, there are a few decent books about them. I think this one is probably the best that I've read. It is about Duane and not about the band, so it doesn't really go up through the 70s and 80s stuff. It kind of talks a little bit about the post-Duane period, but Duane is one of those guitar players in my mind who really could do no wrong. Studio, live, everything. Now, granted, as a man, he died young. He was, I think, 24. stupid death. But because he wasn't, I mean, yes, he was a full-grown man at 24, but God knows, I'm going to turn 52 later this year. I'm nowhere near the same person I was at 24, and I look back at my 24-year-old self and think, man, you were such an idiot back then. So Duane, I like to think, would have grown and developed and become a more fully formed person than he was then. I mean, he was, of course, in typical 24-year-old rock star fashion, sticking all kinds of stuff up his nose. But a lovely guy and a really charismatic kind of figure. In fact, he was so charismatic and so central to the DNA and identity of that band. It is kind of surprising that they managed to continue after he died. And not only that, their popularity grew after he died. Maybe that had something to do with it. But you know, of course, what happened to Barry a year later. But was trying to get his life back together at the very end, and one stupid decision that, you know, typical 24-year-old guy feeling invincible and driving a little unsafe, but a good story, great story if you're a guitar fan or Duane Allman fan. A little bit of a left turn. In Search of the Laws, A Secret Liverpool. If you don't know the Laws, they released one album during the lifetime of the band. There's been a ton of different versions of those recordings because they recorded that album 3 or 4 times because Lee Mavers wasn't happy with it. He is such a weird, enigmatic, odd guy, but an absolute genius pop song writer in my opinion. But a really cool book written by a fan because after there was a period after they were split, I think they split 91, right around there, where everyone was expecting what's Lee Mavers going to do now? He's the genius of the band, and he kind of disappeared, and nobody had heard from him, and that lasted probably 15 years before he sort of reemerged again. But this guy was a fan of the Laws and decided, I'm going to track him down, and of course it wouldn't be much of a book if he didn't find him. He does find him and talk to him. But it's a really cool, if you're into the Laws, it's that album that has the eye, the close-up picture of an eye on it. In my mind, one of the more perfect pop albums ever. There's not a weak moment on it. And just a tragic thing that they only got that one album before they exploded. Too bad, because I think he had a lot more to offer. Okay, Bond, the last highway or lost highway? Last Highway. It's came out a couple of years ago. About Bon Scott and AC/DC. Great book, and another one that is kind of written from a fan perspective, and in this case that's not necessarily a bad thing. You don't walk away from this book with the highest opinion of Angus and Malcolm, I'm afraid. But then again, in their defense, you know, in the late 70s, the world wasn't anywhere near as sophisticated about dealing with an alcoholic as we are today. So yeah, Bon would have been a difficult bandmate, let's put it that way. But this guy, the author, poses some different theory about his death that is a little different from how history records it. But a really neat story, a really neat idea for the book, where it's not Bond's life story. It's like the last year and a half of his life, basically. It does give you some background and everything, but the meat of it is the sprint toward the end, really, of his life. And Bond's a lot more complex and deep than he often gets credit for. I think he's one of the genius rock and roll lyric writers ever. Nobody wrote more songs about rock and roll than Bon Scott. If you look at his output with AC/DC, there's so many songs about being in a rock band, about rock music, which I think is really cool. But so I adore Bon. I'm still sad every day that he's gone. But a great book, and a fairly recent one. This one isn't about a band necessarily, but it's about the history of bootleg recordings. And it talks about, it's called Bootleg, The Rise and Fall of the Secret Recording Industry. A really neat idea to it goes back to the Great White Wonder and, Liver Than You'll Ever Be, those early Blueberry Hill, those early bootleg albums. And it tells the story of how they happened. Like, it's fascinating to hear how some of those early bootlegs, you're like, how did they get a hold of this? He tells how they got a hold of it. How did they get some record? I mean, you can't do it in your basement. I can't, if it's 1972, I can't go in my basement and make vinyl records. You got to have a record plant, where they press records. How do you get it? How do you get them to do your bootleg? He explains it all, and it's fascinating. Really cool story, especially if you're like me and totally into, not so much as I used to be, because bootlegs are so easy to get now. You just go and download them. You can buy them on eBay and Amazon. Amazon sells tons of bootlegs. But back in the day, the 80s, where it was trading tapes and everything, I'd put an ad in Goldmine, and I'd be trading cassettes with guys in Turkey and stuff. It was awesome. Half the fun of it was making these connections and hunting things down. Do you have Tulsa from April 1970? It was that kind of stuff. Today it's easy. You just look it up and they're all there. But good book. Another one here. Speaking of complex individuals, this is a Neil Young bio called Shaky, and this is absolutely written by a fan. But I thought well done. Not gushing. It's still fairly critical in the spots where it needs to be. But Neil Young as an individual is endlessly fascinating. And for my money, this is I've got, I don't know, maybe a half dozen Neil books. This is at the top of the heap. Another good one. Just to hear, his life story, before Buffalo Springfield, all that kind of history stuff, all in there. And this goes up to fairly present day. I don't know what year this came out, but it doesn't end in 1978. It's fairly up to date. Good book, Shaky. Save that one for later. Okay. John Lydon. He's written 2 autobiographies, but this is the first one. It's just called Rotten. No Irish, no blacks, no dogs. And he's another guy that is one of the more compelling rock and roll characters. If you call John Rotten is kind of the character, John Lydon is the guy. I mean, the difference between Sid Vicious and Johnny Rotten is Johnny Rotten understood that he was John Lydon, and Rotten was his rock and roll sort of persona. Sid never got the difference. That's why Sid's dead. But Johnny could sort of turn it off and be a normal person when he wants to. But another really great one, written from his perspective. And of course he is, if there's anything that describes Johnny Rotten, it is brutally honest and very candid. Talks a lot about his relationships with the band. And this does, of course, go through Pill and all that. It's not just the Pistols. But great read. And it's one of those ones that, you can sort of dip into it and put it away for a month and then pick up somewhere else. You don't have to read it in a linear kind of way. Good book. How about Elvis? The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, Careless Love. This is part 2 of Goralnik, is that his name? He had, the first one was called Last Train to Memphis, and that kind of was the build-up of his career. And this is the start of the downhill slide. Where does it start? I don't know where it starts. Probably starts with his movie career, probably that period. It goes all the way up to the end. But another one that is sort of definitive. And if you want to know how Elvis kind of fell apart, it's one of those ones that was years in the making. But a great book, and I'm a big Elvis fan. In fact, I'm an unusual Elvis fan in that I thought the 70s was the best. I mean, there's really kind of 3 Elvises. There's the before he went into the army, there's the 60s movie Elvis, and then there's sort of 69 Vegas all the way up until the end. My favorite Elvis is the 70s Elvis. And he spends a good bit of time on that period. But Elvis was eccentric is a generous way of putting it. A lunatic is a different way of putting it. And I don't mean that in a dangerous kind of way. He was just a little bit nutty, an unusual guy. But really cool Elvis book. Elvis is another one. I probably got 30 Elvis books, but that was my favorite. Okay, speaking of rock and roll books that are the best rock and roll books about any band, this book called Moon, The Life and Death of a Rock Legend by Tony Fletcher. This is a well-written book. And the author is somebody who loves Keith Moon, and actually had met him shortly before he died. But man, I'll tell you, Keith Moon's life story is it's a wonder that they haven't done a kind of a walk the line type movie about Keith's life, because man, what an odd character he was. Now today, I'm guessing with our sort of sensibility of today, Keith would be diagnosed with some kind of Asperger's syndrome or something on that spectrum of autism somehow, way at the high functioning end, but not a normal person. And I don't mean normal in a pejorative kind of way. He was a different kind of guy, and the just reading through this, you just it's incomprehensible how much he drank. But just ungodly amounts of cognac. And cocaine, of course, too. But really, really interesting life story. And one of the more predictable rock and roll deaths. It's a wonder that he lived as long as he did. But also one of the more tragic. I mean, at the end, he was trying to get himself together. He had quit drinking, which for Keith kind of meant he wasn't going to down a bottle of brandy for breakfast every day. And was taking that medication to wean him off alcohol. But, of course, that's what killed him. Now, he ended up with, this is my own theory, Keith ended up with, the autopsy shows, in his belly, he's undigested, undissolved, there were still 26 undissolved heminevrin pills in his belly. Now, I think he took a total of 32 or something like that, and 26 were undissolved. In whatever state you are in, I know when you get messed up, it's hard to keep track of what amount of pills you've taken. But that number of pills really has to make you wonder whether he was trying to take his own life and succeeded in doing it. But I don't know. But great story, and talk about a complex person. That was Keith, and just utterly insecure. The guy who was, you can call greatest drummer or best drummer. There's a lot of guys who are talked about. He's a contender for that. Having all of that and still not having a sense of self-worth, I mean, he couldn't turn it off. He was like, today, they would follow him around with cameras and make a reality show of him. Just all you'd have to do is follow him around, and every day you'd have an episode of Moon the Loon, But a sad, depressive person, too. But cool book, not just for Who fans, but any rock fans would enjoy that book, I think. Kind of a cautionary tale, too. All right, we're going to end with, well, no, we got two more. Going back to Zeppelin, the Tight But Loose Files. This is another Dave Lewis book. And again, I would really say that anything by Dave Lewis is essential for even casual Zeppelin fans. But this one kind of goes through some of the Tight But Loose material that he from the Fan magazine that he compiled into a book. Talks about bootleg recordings, has some interview transcripts, and it's a little bit of everything. It's kind of an overview kind of book. So even I think a casual Zeppelin fan, if you like the music or like the fourth album and like Kashmir and wanted to learn a little bit more about the band, that's not a bad place to start, because it gives a little bit of everything. doesn't tell the story of they were founded on this day. You know, it's not really written like that. It just sort of dips in and out of different ideas and reviews of things. I like it. I still go back to this and read through it occasionally. Lastly, but not leastly, another Andy Babiak book. That Beatles gear book. He did one for the Stones. I'm hoping he's able to do the authoritative Zeppelin book. But he goes through, and of course for the Stones, it's a thicker book than the Beatles, simply because they've been around forever. But he goes through all the different guitars they used on different songs, different sessions, different tours, different periods of the band. For me, it kind of gets cool when it gets into the 70s, when Keith gets the telly, and you get the different guitars that he was using around the Some Girls period. This one goes up to fairly recent too. So another good one. The only period of the Stones instruments that I didn't like was, of course, the tour that I saw them on, '89, when they were using those Music Man, Of course, they pulled out tellies and they were playing vintage instruments, but I don't know if they had some kind of endorsement deal with that company at the time, but they were playing some pretty ugly guitars that haven't aged well, in my opinion. But another great rock and roll book. So this is just a smattering of some. I literally have, hundreds in the room next door, hundreds of rock and roll books, so it's hard to pick out, a top 10 or something. But these are just ones that I thought, if you were looking for your next rock and roll book and didn't know what to get, and one of these bands interests you, these might be some to check out. Maybe next time I'll do specifically about Zeppelin books, ones to track down, or something like that. Books about guitars or something. But for now, enjoy. Good luck.